come into play later. But for those of you who did raise your hand, I'm proud of you, even if it was a little under the desk. We're going to talk about fem. Fem can mean feminism, feminists, feminist theory and inquiry or analysis. Usually feminism kind of means all of these things because it's just kind of strategic to be able to use one word to mean a bunch of different things. I'm not going to give you a definition right now because feminism talks about everything and every different sect disagrees with one another on something different. So it's hard to give you a kind of definition. But feminism is the school of thought. Feminists are the people who ascribe to that. And feminist theory is when you apply the sort of political movement, social movement to philosophy and kind of a way of theorizing and thinking about things. And inquiry is kind of the same thing. It's just when you look at something and you inquire, you ask questions. You usually try and orient the questions you ask around feminism, the school of thought. There's so many houses up here. Okay, so I have goals today. They are mainly to teach you about feminism in a way that you'll respect it, and to teach you to be able to use feminist theory and analysis. You don't have to be a feminist, whatever, you're lost. Those are my goals. And if you can respect it, then you can engage critically with it in a way where you will be able to debate it, and also hear it debated and answer it. And you will also, if you are able to analyze it in a effective way. I mean, everyone knows that analysis goes well with debate. Do I have to explain the internal link there?
No.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I want to start off with a few things. This gets me a little too right every time I watch it or listen to it. This is a woman, I forget her name right now. She played Sojourner Truth in a movie. She's presenting at Congress when they're unveiling the Sojourner Truth bust. Is anyone familiar with the speech, "Ain't I a Woman"? Okay, a few people. Is anyone not familiar with it? That's what I'm interested in. Okay, this is a very powerful speech delivered by, does anyone not know who Sojourner Truth is? She was an abolitionist, Underground Railroad, that type of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I had a finger puppet.
Sorry?
I had that finger puppet. Remember when we got the women's?
Oh, yeah. And a finger puppet.
I should have brought her.
You could have, yeah.
I'm now washed. A finger puppet.
All right, just to erase the finger puppet thing. Everything I said before that's true. So before Congress, by the way, look who's chilling out right here. Before Congress, she is delivering Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech that Sojourner Truth delivered to a group of early feminists and abolitionists. We're talking early, like Underground Railroad, like slavery era. So let's just watch and listen to that.
Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think between the women of the North and the niggers of the South all thinking about rights, you white men gonna be in a fix pretty soon. What was all this talking about? This man over there, yes, you. He said women have to be helped in the carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Well, nobody ever helped me in no carriage. Over no mud puddles who gives me any best place and ain't our woman. Look at me. Look at my arms. I done plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't our woman. Then they talk about this thing in the head, but I'm not going there yet, because I want to tell you that I done birthed 13 children and saw the most all sold out to sleep. And when I talks about this thing in the head. What's that they call it? They call it intellect. Intellect, that's it, sugar. What's that got to do with women's rights or niggers' rights? If my cup don't hold but a pint and yours hold a quart, would you be mean not to let me have my little half a pint? Huh? Then, this man in the black, yes, yes, he says, women can't have as much rights as men because Christ was a woman. Well, where your Christ come from? Where your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man didn't have nothing to do with it. Now, if the first woman God ever made was able to take this world and turn it upside down, all these women's hair together ought to be able to get it back and turn it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it. You men better let them. That's all I have to say. Much obliged for you listening to me. Thank you very much.
All right. Any clarifications, like things you didn't understand? Any references you didn't get? Okay, good. I think this speech is telling. It is a short speech. It gets to the point of exactly what she's trying to do at that gathering, and it raises a lot of issues. She talks about the system of oppression that she finds as being social, physical, mental, emotional, and material. And those are basically the stems for all of the different branches of feminism today, and much of identity politics. And this was in abolitionist times. And this woman, in 2 minutes, set the grounds for all of identity politics today, with humor and emotion and passion. Not only is that a good model for what you all should be doing in debate, but it's also pretty important for feminism. The way that she addresses things like social roles, the way that feminism addresses social roles is that we look at what women should be doing and men should be doing in society. Men should be helping women into carriages. Women should be helped into carriages. Women should be on a pedestal in the best places of society, while men create those structures and decide who goes there. Physical. She says, look at my arms. You know, she was born into slavery. Her arms are strong, they're big. She does a lot of physical labor, but women are supposed to be dainty, right? So what, but she's a woman. I mean, she makes the claim, ain't I a woman? And no one says, you know, no one doubts that Sojourner Truth was a woman. Mental prowess and way of thought. This is a way of addressing the world. She talks about her power. She says that she says intellect, the thing in your head. Men would describe that as, I use that essentially, I don't mean every man, I just mean in the essential term. Men would describe that as being mathematical, objective, removed from the self, scientific, whereas she says that she has intellect because she birthed 13 children and saw most of them born off into slavery, or sold off into slavery, and she cried off, only Jesus could hear her. And she sees that as a type of intellectual strength. That is a more feminine, essentially feminine way of thinking about the world, right? There's the mathematical masculine, then there's kind of an emotional feminine, where you look at the world and intellect through more like, I don't know, you hear the phrase woman's intuition. I'm not too okay with that phrase, but I think it does a good job of explaining kind of the mental processes that the essential feminine would defend. But is that clear for everyone? Okay. And lastly, she talks about the material. I don't mean like clothing or, you know, whatever she's wearing. I mean, what kind of clothing? Material as in like Marxism, capitalism, those kinds of theories where we're talking about resources and certain privileges that people have. For example, if my cup holds a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't it be mean for you not to let me have my fair share? That is a way that, not just in feminism, but across the board, oppression is sustained through access to material goods or resources. Right? Doesn't have, like Ivan was saying, doesn't have to be just money, doesn't have to be nuclear weapons, doesn't have to be anything in particular, it's just that sort of drive. Now, feminism also goes away from from identity politics into the kind of international sphere. And so, these are my two videos I'm going to show. But I'm going to show the second one right off the bat because I think they're a great introduction of telling you what feminism is without explicitly defining it. Okay, this is a lecture given by a famous feminist theorist, but also she writes a lot of debate evidence. Her name is Cynthia Enloe. She got into feminism pretty late in life. She wasn't a feminist until after her PhD, and she's talking here about how she got into it. She thought she wanted to study things like war, how you cut and to make war, what has to happen in order for war to exist. She realized that she had written a book about it, all of war, a huge book, looked at the index and realized that there was no women in her book. And so she's thinking about here in this lecture how that is possible and how easy it is for us to think about war and its effects and war itself without realizing its different effects on different groups of people. She mentions a name you don't recognize or a word you don't recognize. She's probably talking about the name of this Iraqi woman that she's just referencing. But we're going to take a look at this for about 3 minutes.
Elite of Iraq, but the ordinary people. Of Iraq's economy. Many institutions had to close. There were many shortages. Life became very difficult for Iraqis during the international sanctions, and we can talk about international sanctions if you want. But one of the things that I learned was that international sanctions do not necessarily affect women and men in the country that they're directed against, in this case against Iraq, the same way. And here's how it was different in Iraq. And this is going to have a big effect on Maha.
Maha, that's the Iraqi woman that she's speaking about. She used her as kind of...
Because she, as we will see, is going to desperately need a paying job. The international sanctions against Iraq hit...
Well, Dave. Let's let that move a little bit. So everyone follows what she's saying so far, yes?
Yeah.
There are international sanctions against Iraq in the first Iraq War, and she's starting to realize that they affect men and women differently. So let's talk about this for a little bit until that's noted. Feminism in the international sphere is usually abbreviated as FemIR. It looks at international politics just like anyone would, except it tries to focus on questions of gender. And you know those questions of thought that I talked about, the masculine way of thinking and the feminine way of thinking? It criticizes or at least traces how the people in power and the decisions they make create a trend in international politics, the way that countries and larger international bodies relate with each other. And the trend is overwhelmingly that there are a lot of masculine, very strategic, violence-prone, aggression-prone policies, rather than policies geared more toward peace or geared at least toward noticing difference in the individuals that they affect, not the countries. We don't talk about the way they affect Iraq, but we talk about the way that they affect the citizens of that country, the men, the women, the children, everything in between, and otherwise. That's a funny meme that I like. Ryan Gosling. Who doesn't love Ryan Gosling?
Wait, what'd you say?
The hegemonic relationship between the state and the prison industrial complex cannot hold if we plan to develop as a nation. It'll always hold you. Some key terms, it's just a fun, I liked it, I like Ryan Gosling. But anyway, some key terms that we're going to get to before we move on really are Patriarchy. This can be defined in a number of ways. A lot of people disagree with it. Like I said, feminism is basically just a system of liberation and disagreement nowadays. Patriarchy is usually defined as, originally it was more like the way you think of it in like an anthropology class, right? Like a governmental or social hierarchy system where men, usually older men, the patriarch of the family, hold the decision-making power. In this, it's interesting because then the younger men have just as much of a political not just as much, but have just as much, find themselves oppressed in a similar way to women, which is interesting because we don't usually think about that when we talk about patriarchy nowadays, which we now have come to think about as a social force. It is a social, kind of ubiquitous force made up by norms, laws, individual thoughts, perceptions, advertisement, the media, you name it, and just individual kind of ways of being and displaying ourselves that create a system where men can oppress women. I take a little bit of, I take that definition with a grain of salt. I prefer to think of it as same thing about that social force, but where masculine or men or males are privileged over women or preferred. We've got sex and we've got gender. We've also got sexual orientation / preferences. These three terms are the most conflated terms I have ever come across in academia.
Wait, what terms conflated?
Sex, gender, sexual orientation / preferences. People will use words that signify sex. People will use words that signify any of these interchangeably. What I mean is, have you ever taken a survey and it says, what is your gender? And then you have a male box and a female box. I hate that. I hate that, and here's why. Because sex is biological. It's what you've got going down, it's genitalia, it's biological, it's insides, it's genes. Gender is, kind of think of it almost as a personality, but not necessarily your individual personality, rather something that goes along with social expectations. Like, I'm wearing a dress because I'm a girl, and I want to be seen as girly. Sexual orientation / preferences is, I want to be seen as girly, so I'm wearing this dress that I hope men will find attractive because I'm heterosexual. Okay? Does everyone know the difference?
Can you explain the difference between gender and sexual orientation a little more?
Yes and no. Gender, social expectations, there are social expectations that someone looking like me would be heterosexual. Because A, I'm a woman, and B, I'm dressed in a dress. However, if I had short spiky hair and I wore masculine clothes and, Timberland boots or something, there would be a social expectation maybe that I would be a lesbian. So they are interrelated. The same way that sometimes, like testosterone or whatever, can determine your gender or something. But sexual orientation is separate because I can choose or I can be a different sexual orientation than what my gender appearance would indicate. Yes, Walt?
So I've also heard there's almost like a gender spectrum, like some people don't feel like specifically male or female. Yeah.
Gender spectrum, male, female. Gender spectrum, male, female.
Would it be, would your preferred term be gender spectrum masculine, feminine?
Boom!
Yeah.
Jack's on it. It's a whole way of thinking and communicating that is ingrained in our minds that allows us to conflate these things. And when you conflate these things, you set boundaries on what people can be and feel they can be, and then therefore like achieve or do or feel ashamed about or proud about, right? Like if I were a lesbian and I looked like this and everyone here expected me to be heterosexual, I can feel that, and I can, kind of sets up a structure in this room for me to be ashamed to be attracted to another woman. because I feel like I am breaking a rule or going against a law by being what I am.
So the idea of sex and gender are two separate things, or are they similar?
They're all interrelated, which is the hard part. However, they are separate things.
So like sex is what you're naturally born with, and gender is like if you change yourself, that's what you are currently.
Are you talking about like trans?
Yeah,
Like, where you
I
get
guess so.
surgeries and stuff?
Yeah.
Gosh, that is so complicated. It probably falls more into Jackie's lecture than mine.
We'll talk about it.
But yeah, gender's more like a performance of who you are and what you look like and what you choose to do and what you feel like you should be doing. And sex is just biological.
Like, sex is like what you're born with, gender is what you identify with.
Okay. Post-feminism is a response to a certain type of feminism where people have kind of the same goals or feel similar ways that feminists would feel, but they do not wish to identify with it. They don't want to prescribe to the F word. You know, but instead of half raising their hand, they just put it down altogether and identify as a new group. Sex positive. This is an adjective used to describe philosophy or way of thinking or mode of feminism that encourages sex and feels it is healthy. Not just like we should have sex, but rather, let me explain the sex negative part first. Sex negative is, an adjective used to describe a mode of thought or philosophy or movement or whatever that disapproves of sex. Like, a lot of people would use the example of Catholic guilt. If you have sex before marriage, you're damned. Or like Republican conservatives, or women, or not women, but feminists who look at prostitution or porn as being harmful to women because it objectifies them, and it's just, you're just giving the men what they want, which is just your body, and they're not thinking about all the other parts of you. That is a sex negative way of thinking. Sex positive could see.
Sex negative also be just people who think that like women are sluts.
Yeah,
about guys, good job.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a double standard. That's what we call a double standard, where if I have sex with 10 people, I'm a whore. If I haven't had sex with 10 people, he gets high fives on the way to the locker room. Whereas sex positive would see that as either a good thing, or rather like an empowering thing, or a liberating thing, or a way to express myself, or even just kind of a neutral thing. Just like it's a thing, whatever. Proto-feminism is a term used to describe the feminist ways of thought before they called themselves feminists. Some people will just call them feminists, but historians like to call them proto-feminists, like a prototype for feminism, before feminism. Sexism is just as confusing as everything over there, but it's broadly used as like a way to describe oppression when you're talking about gender. But I guess literally it would just mean like males and females discriminating against one another in certain ways. Like women are biologically dumber than men. Males are biologically dumber or smarter than women, or females. Questions?
So women can be sexist?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Anyone could. We all probably are. Just the way that everyone's kind of racist. Let's back up a minute. See if this is ready yet. Does anyone not remember where we left off? She just says the Iraqi war affected men and women differently, and she's about to get into that.
She stopped at Mahal.
The state economy first, that is what we would call public jobs first. It hit all the things that the government under Saddam Hussein funded. That is hospitals, schools, museums, all the big construction works which were state funded, the oil economy, the oil industry, they were all under the state. Now in Iraq, this is why you have to do a gender analysis before you decide whether any international sanctions against any country in fact will really be useful. Nobody at the UN did a gender analysis of the international economic sanctions. Nobody in the US administration did a gender analysis. So that's why you've got to take women's studies courses so you know how to do gender analysis, right? It's really important that you be able to weigh public policy decisions by being able to figure out what their consequences are going to be. And it's one of the great tools that feminism has given us. Well, it turns out, and we only knew this belatedly because Iraqi analysts began to do this work. And what they found was that in Iraq, from the 1960s through the 70s and the 80s, women were more likely to get state jobs than to get public sector jobs. That women were more likely to get the paid jobs as professionals, as petroleum engineers. Women were highly educated in Iraq as petroleum engineers, as bookkeepers, as civil engineers, as doctors, as nurses, as teachers, as museum curators, working for a government agency. Which means that when the international economic sanctions were imposed on Iraq to penalize it for having invaded Kuwait, you with me here, 1991, 2003, who did they hit more than whom? They hit women in paid jobs more than they hit men. That doesn't mean that male Iraqis weren't affected by the international sanctions, but they were more likely to be able to get or already have a private sector job.
Okay. What are some important things that she talked about here? I don't mean necessarily the content, like what happened in Iraq after the sanctions. I mean like larger concepts applicable to feminism.
Meta level.
Yeah, meta level. Yeah.
Like whenever stuff happens to their countries, the UN doesn't really do like a gender analysis. Like no one how it's going to affect like certain people. All they did was just do any act that seemed to be best.
Okay, what does that interact with in the kind of concepts I was talking about? That's kind of a vague question. Yes, gender analysis, right? That's one of the things I wanted you to learn how to be able to do. Look at a public policy or philosophy or current issue and be able to think about it in not just a does it solve, but does it solve for whom and how kind of way. Also, she talks about, like Christian was saying, like an international sphere, like the UN did this but didn't think about the other things because they were thinking in a way that was traditional for the international sphere. Like, will this work? Will the Iraqis stop doing this? Will Saddam Hussein do whatever? Rather than, will different kinds of citizens feel different kinds of effects? Anything else?
Question.
Yeah.
So if you do that and decide that different citizens will feel the effects differently, does that mean you don't do it even though it solves, according to this philosophy?
Well, that is a critique versus planned debate. So that's up to the debaters or the people making decisions in the real world. More often than not, they'll do it anyway. But the interesting thing about that is they do it anyway because of the type of people making those decisions. I can tell you that if I were in charge of the UN, we wouldn't have done that, right? I can tell you that, I don't know, plenty of things. Who's in charge?
The decisions that are made are influenced by the leaders making those decisions, right? That's one of the reasons for why there's such a push to have more women on higher level government positions, because it would probably change the direction of many public policy decisions. And so decisions like that might be drastically different depending on who is making those decisions, because they would consider things different, right? That's some of the idea of a critique. The assumptions behind the way someone thinks that influences the way they implement that policy.
And the way of looking at those results. Right, like you said, but it solves, all right, but is that, number one, is that what we should be looking at, is what a FemK would say, and number two, does it solve for whom? It solves for maybe the United States, and maybe it changes Saddam Hussein, But all those other people who may outweigh in even a utilitarian kind of context, just sheer numbers of people, should we be looking at them? Are the questions a femk runner, arguer, feminist would ask.
Oh, just one other question. Is this the same as like the sort of like FemK that I went to last year? That was like space exploration exists entirely for the purpose of subjugating women, or is that a different type of FemK?
I don't know. I didn't read the space FemK. I don't know why space exploration would subjugate women, but if you could give me the warrant, then we could talk about it.
Okay,
If you just gave me the tag, I need the warrant.
I know like a lot of them like they'd say like that faith in masculinity, like a lot of things like going to war because you put like a weapon in space that's masculine like a weapon. Like that's what they say.
Well, Jack, if you want to know more about the how space shapes women, you should go to the Georgetown Day seminar. Wiki from last year, I gave an entire lecture on women in space. Answered questions like this. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest you go see that. Go watch that because I discuss a lot of those things. But there are a number of reasons why I think space subjugates women. I don't want to underscore anything, but if you look at the traditional history of the space program, it's led mostly by masculine figures. Women are very late into the program. They've always been a bit disadvantaged. There are also discussion about things like, the shape of rockets, the shape of space shuttles. So, there are a number of different links as to why space subjugates women. Part of it's the history of the program, the people making the decision, the choice of the style of technology that we use, and new programs. Women are often left out, and their voices aren't always heard. So there's a number of reasons. So if you're really into that, I would definitely go back and watch that lecture. It's a very long. I lectured for 2 hours just on women in space last year.
Okay. So to dovetail off of what Cynthia Enloe had been saying, here is a piece of debate evidence that I have read in a debate round and used. Well, why don't you read it and tell me the significance. Tell me why I'm having you read it. Who wants to read this out loud? Oh, yeah, David. Go for it.
Just the highlighted parts?
Just the highlighted parts will be fine.
Alright. For society to move into an armed conflict, there will necessarily be a build-up of aggression. As tremendous destruction requires aggression, and group cohesion needs to be assured to provide unity against the enemy. Thus, aggressive behavior at all levels may be reinforced and rewarded, may become a deliberate way of achieving a group cohesion. In light of the above, women, like other lower status groups, or men not conforming to a hyper-masculine ideal, may be first experience the deterioration of human security levels that eventually culminates into a more widespread crisis, potentially foreshadowing armed conflict. If we accept this argument, then gender-sensitive early warning indicate and a gendered analysis are indispensable for more accurate early warning. Linked to this early detection advantage, gender analysis can draw attention to deviating behavioral patterns and demographic trends, and therefore highlight dysfunctionalities that could be precursors to armed conflict.
Okay, why? Why is this important? Why did I have you read it? I had you read it because it's exactly what Cynthia Enloe was talking about and what I was trying to talk about. This was one of my answers to, I would say like the alternative solves war, patriarchy causes war. They would say you can't look at it like that, you can't look at root causes, you have to look at proximate causes, like what exactly leads to war, like a shortage of oil led to an invasion, not someone was feeling aggressive so they invaded. This was my answer, one of them. It uses empirical data, it uses observations from political scientists. It says, empirically, when a country is preparing for war, there's a buildup of a certain kind of behavior. Some of the indicators of that can be things like violence against groups low in status, domestic violence, bar fights, and vandalism. Those things can increase because the entire country as a whole is feeling a more warlike ideology, a more warlike
Mentality.
what?
Mentality.
Push, right? So it says, so here are the indicators we can look at to see how to solve war, rather than just, well, you know, if patriarchy is there, then it'll cause war. You know, this is an answer to someone who's saying, but I need the exact cause, and you can say, well, here's how you can look at it, do it. It makes your alternative much more real world and much more concrete, and it makes you look much more credible. Yes, Jack?
What was your case for this event?
What was my case? It was just a critique.
Okay. What was your alternative?
Essentialism. They have a bunch of different kinds, a bunch of different alternatives. So that's kind of the debating end of things. Some important things to know are feminism as we know it today has come from, it has a history. A lot of people like to group it into 3 waves. There's the first wave, which was early feminism. People say it's more of a push for political equality or voice politically to be heard, like voting. It was in the 18 and 1900s in the UK and the United States. People usually say it ended the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was allowed women to vote. A lot of people say that the second wave spurred up in the 1960s, and this was a more social kind of feminism, where people looked at these social structures and they wanted equality socially, like in people's minds, how they regarded them, not just necessarily with political rights. Now they say that as for the 1990s, we're in a third wave, which is just kind of an amalgamation of different ways of looking at gender. They see gender, they don't just look at the social ways that we evaluate males and females, but they rather look at what causes us to identify in a certain amount of genders, right? Someone here said that they want equality for both genders. Are there only 2? Why do we think there are only 2? What other ones could there be? This is more Jackie's realm. These 3 waves have spurred a lot of different modes of thought: separatist feminism, equality feminism, standpoint feminism, black feminism, masculinities, all these sorts of things. We can go into detail about it if you're interested later. A lot of people also don't like to look at the waves, because it kind of ignores, well, if first wave ended in the passage of the 19th Amendment, and the second wave started in the 1960s, what happened in that 40-year period? It was a rhetorical question.
I would maybe
Yeah, you don't have to ask that. Well, 2 world wars were there. So a lot of different people were in the workforces, namely different classes and sexes and genders. So when you look at the waves, you forget about all the different kind of grassroots infection, I use the word loosely, of feminism that happened in those 40-year period. You know, people who usually wouldn't work, being in the workplace, feel empowered or think about themselves in different ways than they usually would, and different ideas are spread in a different way among different people than they usually would. So that's the problem with thinking of it in waves. Also, it makes it very hard to identify. It's very rigid. If you think of black feminists as only coming out in the 1960s, black feminists are more of a way of thinking about not just gender and sex, but rather race and other forms of social location like class. So if you think of black feminism as only coming out of the 1960s because of things like the civil rights movement and them criticizing regular feminism, the other waves, the other forms of feminism for focusing more on kind of white women who are middle class and have nothing better to do than sit at home and read books about empowerment, so they get out and start burning bras, right? Well, sort of black feminists don't have that ability because they're in a lower class, so they have to work, and they don't have that time to participate in the same amount of activism. If you think about that as only starting in the 60s, then you miss out on people like Sojourner Truth, who is pretty race conscious for all of her feminist inclinations. Because feminism also started before the 1800s, 1900s. I guess proto-feminism also started. Yeah, there are lots of different kinds. It's not just about women either. It's just that because of the overarching focus on men as the norm, a lot of the feedback from that has been feminists focusing on women to kind of counterbalance everything, which is one of the reasons why feminists get the reputation as being man-hating. The other is like from 1960s and 70s, separatist feminism, where women decided they wanted to live apart from men and become lesbians. Either they were already or chose to be, even without really being attracted to women organically. Fun fact, those are the reasons why people think feminists is hating men. So, a few seconds ago, I kind of talked about how black feminists would look at other forms of feminism as focusing only on what? On what?
Social status?
Kind of upper class white women. So that kind of feeds into one of the other terms that we should talk about, which is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that we should look at not just one thing, not just gender or sex, but rather how all the different things intersect. Right? I am not just... Some forms of feminism would ask me to think of myself as just a woman, whereas intersectional ideas of feminism would ask me to think of myself as a woman, a white woman, a young white woman, a middle-class, educated white woman, all of those different ands, and to see where they intersect. Another idea closely related to that is essentialism. Essentialism is what third-wave feminists and post-feminists kind of have against earlier forms of feminism. It is the idea that there are essential things that define a woman or a man. Right? Not just penis, vagina, but rather all women have to be helped into carriages. You know what I mean? Things like that. Things like women are more oriented toward peace and nature and nurturing. Sometimes people can think that's true. For myself, I think certain things about that are true. However, the problem becomes when you encounter a woman who doesn't feel that way. A woman with strong arms who has birthed 13 children and hasn't raised most of them. A woman who doesn't need help into a carriage and has never occupied the best places of society. Ain't I still a woman? That's where the problem becomes. From there, a lot of different ideas have looked back and found problems and tried to move forward. Most of that can be grouped into queer theory.
Hey, or Jack,
Go for it.
The idea of feminism, right? It's not really based around actual feministic ideas. It's more like just the idea of feminism being as like a movement for women to actually be empowered, right?
Not even just women.
Well, everybody, but the idea of us creating a gap, doesn't it really like extrude that there is a gap between women and men?
What do you mean?
If we think of it as a gap and we make a movement as a gap, does it make it a bigger gap?
Yes, sometimes. That's a whole other school of feminist thought where people, it's actually kind of a criticism of the term patriarchy. Some people will look at patriarchy and say, well, if patriarchy is a system of oppression, and that's what's holding us down right now, and it's a system of oppression where men are lower than women, or women are lower than men, that already assumes that women are lower than men. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't like to look at it that way. There are a lot of different alternatives. It's being debated now. A lot of it takes place on the debate about patriarchy. They look for different terms. A lot of intersectional feminists or post-colonial feminists or different like cultural, ethnic, racial feminists will look at larger systems to try and figure out what exactly that social system is that's kind of keeping us down. Most people won't disagree that there is a form of oppression somewhere, and there are gaps. That much is a fact. I mean, yes, it's a fact. Some people are lower than others. It's just kind of a matter of, like you said, tracing what those factors are. Because you don't want to say, as you were indicating, that all women are lower than men. Therefore, the therefore from that, dangerous therefore, can be, well, what's a woman? Okay, well, it's someone with these qualities, one of them being lower than men. So if you see a woman who's not oppressed by women, or oppressed by men, someone who's successful in the masculine world, maybe Hillary Clinton, a lot of people will defeminize her, speak of her as a robot, or talk, like, say a lot of very rude things. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Oh, so what's a gender analysis with respect to like foreign policy? I don't really get that.
Looking at gender is a factor. Highlighting that in your brain is something to think about when you analyze public policy or international policy. It's what Cynthia Enloe was doing when she realized that sanctions affected certain genders. It's another thing to look at, another way of thinking. Another lens in your glasses, a magnifying glass.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm just not really sure what that plays into the whole analysis of the, like.
It just analyzes how political actions or choices affect genders differently.
Right, but I just don't understand how the different effect would play into actual like policy-making decisions.
A lot of times it doesn't. But like Christy and I were saying, it all really depends on who's making those decisions. So the reason it doesn't often is because most of the time, upper-class white males who don't have to be concerned about things like that are making these decisions. However, there are lobbying groups, there are advocacy groups, there are certain members of government bodies who try to make those patterns evident so we can change our policy. You could make a feminist policy the same way you'd make any other policy, right? If you go through the same process, except for when you're debating about it, you take into account other things, like gender.
Let me give you some examples, Jack.
Okay, because I'm
when World War II was occurring, and they were deciding how the U.S. was going to handle that war, how they were going to promote it within the United States, how they were going to mobilize in order to deal with the war effort, they specifically targeted women, right? Rosie the Riveter, you all should have seen that. We can do it. I've got posters of it. I've got pot holders from it. I have towels from it. It became a famous symbol of World War II. Women can do it. Women went to the workforce in mass quantities to help with the war efforts a number of ways, right? Some women were just helping with first aid, care package for the troops. Other women were working. And so that's a good example of how gender was considered in public policy, right? They knew they needed to get women involved in the war effort, and so they targeted them in very specific ways to get their help. Okay? The same thing when the war was over, is that they changed their approach to society at that point because they wanted women to go where? World War II ended. Where do they want women to go?
Go back home.
Go back home, right?
You have to take a job.
Right. And if you look at trends in popular culture at the time, during the war, it was all about women can do, and women can fly planes, and women can run machines. And that was very popular in like pop culture. So like entertainment on the radio, for example, was really popular with that. But when the war was over, okay, in the mid-40s and the 50s, it became very much about women needed to go back home. And so you start to see propaganda the opposite way, right? That the best women are staying at home, and the covers of things like Time magazine suddenly became mom at home in a cute dress, making like muffins, and her kids are all happy and excited, and daddy's coming home and he takes off his hat, and it's like the Father Knows Best series and things like that. So that really changes the course of public policy based upon what they need, right? That's a good example of how they're applying gender considerations to policy. Studies that you see, like Emily quoted about sanctions and how they affect certain groups. So those are certain examinations. The healthcare bill. There was a whole discussion in the healthcare bill when that legislation was going through about how it would affect women. So there are places where policy considers gender, but there are some places where they haven't considered gender, and that's when you start to see later analysis of public policy and saying, like, this is indiscriminately disadvantaged certain groups. Does that help? Those are two of the most famous examples of applying gender to
I know, I'm
policy.
just thinking like if I'm, yeah.
I mean, what else do you mean then?
No, I'm just talking about like foreign policy, like if you're trying to make a decision.
Sure, there's all kinds of ways. Okay, when we go into Muslim countries, right, and we provide foreign aid assistance, we can't just go jump into that country and be like, hey, women, here are the things that you can be doing to help your population. Instead, we have to do analysis of the culture in those countries, right? So there's been lots of discussion since we've been involved in this war on terror that never seems to end, about how U.S. foreign aid workers are interacting with women in some of these countries, especially in countries that are predominantly Muslim, and the ways that we're dealing with them. Because the way that we implement aid to those countries in a Muslim country would be very different than the way that we would implement aid to an Asian country, or what we would do within the United States, because there are different concerns for gender based upon culture in those different countries.
Okay.
Right, so, I mean, like, there's also things like the Convention on Women's Rights. There are whole bodies of treaties and declarations and conventions that are focused on dealing with questions like sex and gender.
Okay.
Tons of them. So it's very prominent in foreign policy, public policy. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff has been after the fact work. It's just now starting to be something people consider at the front end instead of the back end of the policy. There are experts in the government who deal with things like feminist theories. Does that answer?
Yes. And is it actually like a philosophical thing, or like a
Or what?
And can you use it to actually make policy more effectively, or is it just like a?
Sure. Many feminist theories would say if you would implement more of these philosophies in public policy would be much more efficient. Yes. Right? And that's the problem with some people's critique about policy. It's like, this is strictly coming from one type of perspective. It doesn't take into consider multiple identities when it decides its policy. Like, this is not a one-size-fits-all. That's definitely, like, that sort of questioning of philosophy is important when talking about public policy, because you have to think about the assumptions behind the policy makers. Any other questions about feminism?
Where can I go to get more information about the differences in movements and feminism? Like the difference between black
See me
feminists
later.
and black movements?
Yes, see Emily later. We'll have some sites up on Wiki. We usually do a day or two after these lectures. We put up a whole list of a couple reading sites. So you should see Emily or me afterwards, and we'll give you a great big list. And we could probably start working through that list together with people later too.
Okay. It's going to be a very interactive lecture, so be ready. First, I want everyone to start saying them without raising hands. I don't really care. Aspects of identity that you think define you.
Mother.
Gender.
Intelligence.
Me. Keep going.
Emotion.
It's a good one.
Intelligence.
What is important is part of it.
It definitely is.
Personality.
Physical appearance.
Race,
Ethics.
Nationality.
Age.
Socioeconomic class.
Physical ability.
Orientation.
Morals.
Religious views.
All right. All right, so if going from this vein, what does this word mean?
my definition for normal is weird because my definition for normal is something that does not exist.
Standard.
Standard.
The social, like the social average, like what people expect.
Okay. Anybody. Super. If you were in school and someone said you're not normal, what do they mean? Stacy.
Society's perception of what you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to be.
Sure. Xander.
A term that should not be applied to people.
Sure. That's something that debate is key for. Maybe analyzing decisions about why we think this is a good use. I'm going to start in the line. I want you to name 3 things about yourself, or 1 thing, I don't really care, that you think society considers normal.
I live in a suburban neighborhood.
Okay.
I have 10 fingers on my hands.
Okay.
I dress like a girl, I don't know.
Physical appearance, you dress like a girl.
I have a sister.
Okay.
I'm stumped.
Okay. If I was in a school cafeteria and I stood up and said, I'm a man, I'm attracted to men, and would I be normal?
Well, be whole.
Considered normal by most
No.
No. What are the 2 reasons I wouldn't be considered normal for?
You're not a man. and
Why?
Because like, technically, pussy is female according to the definition of sex.
Okay. Why would people question the fact that I think I'm a man, but I'm still attracted to men?
Because of your image.
Yeah, sure. Like people would say, if you're straight, why don't you think you're a girl? Or things like that. Or what if I think I'm a man and I'm attracted to women? A lot of people are like, why don't you just say you're a lesbian? Why do you have to think you're a different gender? Or on the opposite, why aren't you attracted to a different sex? These are problems that the idea of queer theory or queer studies evaluates. Because normal, I would say, is kind of static. People think that it's the same thing. You have to be the same as a different person, or else people will judge you. People don't think you fall within a certain category. Why do you all think that might be bad?
It kind of creates this perfect image that when you don't live up to it, you're subjected to criticism. And
Criticism, sure.
It's too much biodiversity on one planet.
Okay. I want more. Come on. Who hasn't felt normal at a certain time in their life?
Every
Or
human ever.
ignored.
Anyone.
Come on, dude. Come on, dude.
I went to a college where if you were biologically a male, but portrayed feminine characteristics, they forced you to go to seminars to pray the gay away. Even if you weren't gay. They put you in a specific category if you put certain characteristics of yourself, emotions, personality, that they consider to be female, automatically put you into the category of being a gay male if you portrayed female characteristics. Why do you think they do that?
It's the norm. Like,
It's the norm. People think that this definition, if you're in school and someone says that's gay, what are they saying?
It's bad.
that's stupid.
That's stupid. That's one certain circumstance. What are some other things?
That's weird.
Weird. Something is female. You're acting like a girl when you're a guy. They say you're acting gay. That's a normalized definition of this word. What if you have this word? And someone calls a girl this. What are they defining her as? Some characteristics of a lesbian.
A man.
A man. You act like a guy. What are some other things?
You hate men?
Sure, but you learned that in the last lecture. These are all things that are a normalized definition of this category. This is a word that's going to come up a lot in this lecture. Why? What is a normalized definition? We've kind of gone over this in the past like minute. Normalized definition is I would say, straight up thought of what something is, a static notion. Could this word change depending on who you are?
Yeah.
Are all lesbians the same? Are all gay people the same? No. But why do they put all these people in certain categories? That's what queer theory tries to question. I'm going to show you all a video so you can understand. It's a YouTube video I found that I thought provided a pretty good definition for what this is.
Hey guys, my name is Kyle, and today's video is being brought to you by the letter Q. That's right, the all too often forgotten part of the LGBTQ community. Looking at dictionary.com, queer as a word refers to something strange or different. The only reason it refers to homosexuals or other members of the LGBT community is because it's been built up as part of our American slang or even hate speech sometimes. Many members of the community find it very offensive if you call them queer. However, the term was reclaimed by the community in the early 1990s after Queer Nation was formed and after a New York Pride parade where they passed out a flyer using the word. Queer now really refers to people who are outside the traditional roles of like gender and sex, such as like male or female or gay, straight, or bi. Basically, it's an ambiguous term that applies to everyone like in between the lines. And in that way, it is not a synonym for LGBT. This encompasses pansexuals, intersexuals, genderqueers, asexuals, autosexuals, people who practice BDSM even if they consider themselves heterosexual, polyamorous people, and even more. The list goes on and on. Queer is just a really good blanket term. Think about it this way. If you consider yourself genderqueer, meaning that you don't fit yourself neatly into male or female, then how are you going to know what your sexual orientation is? Let's say you like men, but you're not sure how to, label your gender. Then does that make you gay, straight, bi, something in between? What? This is where queer comes in. Now there's another term called homosexual, which is just an abbreviation for postmodern sexual. It's kind of an odd term in and of itself, but it basically does not refer to a sexual orientation, but more like a way of thinking. Homosexuals are people that challenge the lines that society has built up surrounding things like gender and sexual orientation and identity. They say, no, sexuality is not binary, gender is not binary, sexual orientation is not binary. Everything is completely fluid and complex, and you can't even label things, really. So being a homosexual kind of just states that you believe that queers exist, that you don't have to fit into these categories. And another name for this way of thinking is called queer theory. One last thing of note that I found while I was researching. We all know about the pronouns he, she, and it. Well, did you know about Z and Zer? Z refers to a gender-neutral way to say he or she, so if a person is queer or transsexual or something in between and you're not sure how to label their gender, you say Z to be respectful. And likewise, Zer is the replacement for his or her. Just thought that was kind of interesting. Hope you guys learned something about what it means to be queer and why it's not the same as being gay or even LGBT. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all this Friday. Bye.
I thought that was just like a pretty good general idea of understanding queer and queer theory. A definition I would provide for you to understand more of what queer theory is that queer theory understands sexuality as fluid, open-ended, and entirely performed. So, fluid. Who knows what the word fluid means? Xander.
Like a liquid or a gas.
Sure, that's like the general idea of what fluid is, just a liquid. Why is a liquid considered fluid?
No, anyway.
Yeah, it's very changeable. There's no static identity for it. You will hear that term a lot if you ever debate queer theory or if you study it. Static identity is criticized in queer theory. So fluid, open-ended. Okay, so in line with this, queer theory thinks that the term queer shouldn't be synonymous with gays, lesbians, transgender. Queer is all-inclusive of the in-between, like he said on his video. It's representative of any and all expressions of sexuality that differ from heterosexuality. It rests on the idea that identities are not fixed. They cannot be categorized and labeled because they consist of many varied components, so that to characterize one by one characteristic is wrong. So if I think of myself as a male and am attracted to women, that kind of puts me in a box if you want to label me. Queer theory criticizes that. You shouldn't try to box people in based upon certain components of their identity. What is heteronormativity? Does anyone know? This is kind of the reason a lot of people think that or study queer theory. Heteronormativity is defined as punitive rules, whether that be social, familial, or legal. So, social is what society thinks, familial, what your family thinks, legal, what the law thinks, that force us to conform to hegemonic heterosexual standards for identity. Heterosexual being the static notion of male-female. Hegemonic is like the power complex of how that works in society. Now, a lot of these standards, like heteronormativity, can be seen in laws that exist today, which queer theory would criticize and say that those are static laws that are heteronormative, i.e. marriage laws now. The idea of marriage, a lot of queer studies would indict that up in a blanket term. The idea of, I guess, female planning would be something that queer theory would indict in laws. Defining a family is something that would be a familial aspect of heteronormativity. One key aspect which would be under the social form is how the church defines, I guess, identity within men, within females, within whatever the in-between is. These are things that you want to investigate if you debate queer theory. If it comes up in any of a debate that you learn, they're going to find reasons that what you're talking about might be an aspect of heteronormativity. Finally, what does it mean to queer something? Queer is a verb as well. To queer something means to problematize the identity of. Does anyone want to give a definition of identity? Because I've been saying that word but haven't really asked yet. Xander?
Who you are.
Sure, that's a really simple question. So, who or what? A lot of policies will define the who or what. Queer theory, or to queer something, would problematize the way that you define the who or the what. If you're defining the who as straight men, or assuming that all the people fall into this category, queer theory, or queering that, would question why said policy assumes this. All right. Why does this matter? We kind of talked about this a little before, of why, I guess, fitting people into boxes might, I guess, exclude people or exclude thoughts. But heteronormative, we call it sexual regulation, creates, I guess, a center where abnormal ways of life are excluded and organized. oftentimes this becomes violent exclusion and violent organization. So that in an attempt to almost eliminate that thought or eliminate that identity. A lot of this, I guess, a lot of these examples came up in the